Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to welcome you to our panel on strategic culture with the focus on geostrategy. I am Thomas Pankratz, and at the National Academy of Defense, I am the main teacher for strategy and security policy. I'm mainly in charge of strategy training in the General Staff Training course and the Master course. You are in one of the rooms that is usually used for training sessions in the National Defense Academy. I'm from the Institute for Strategy and Security Policy. Before starting with the presentations of the panelists, we have 4 presentations. Allow me to give you a brief introduction on the panel and its general structure. I will not be commenting on the contents of the presentations, but just on the main concept that our panel focuses on. It is a very complex concept as such, and we should actually have time until tomorrow for this topic. It's so large, because just the concepts that we will be talking about are very broad and very general. Strategy is the general focus term and key term of this conference, and you will know from the past days that there are very different ideas about what strategy may be defined as. Is it an academic subject? Is it the practical application? Is it some kind of art or ability or skill? Does it involve leading, or rather a practical application of skills? Or is it a mentality? Is it a way of thinking? These are just some of the concepts. In this context, I always think of Clausewitz, who says that in these concepts, everybody believes what they choose to believe. The second term we will be focusing on in this panel is culture. Not a simple term at all. It comes from colere, to cultivate. According to Kant, culture is to be seen in the context of civilization, and there are very different concepts of culture. Is it a set of values and standards and perceptions, attitudes, or is it rather something that is defined by Kant's categoric imperative? Or is culture just the production of Mozart chocolates and Lipizzaner horses as we see it in Austria? Or in Germany, Goethe and literature. These are all cultural concepts. But our panel would be too easy if we just had strategy and culture. If we put these two concepts together, we get strategic culture. The term itself, you may know, was first used in 1977 by Jack Snyder in one of his papers. There were concepts on strategic culture before that in terms of national character studies, the political character of a state, and further developments of the concept that I do not want to focus on here for the sake of brevity. Many of you had the opportunity to take part in a 2-day symposium on this topic recently. That was mainly on strategic culture, and where this was the main topic of discussion. We had a dialogue on it and not a discussion, because we actually didn't get a clear result. It is a very open concept and issue. Just 2 things that I would like to use in terms of definition. We have sort of agreed on one definition or one approach to defining strategic culture. I will not be reading it to you. The most decisive point is that strategic culture should be developed further in 3 points. First of all, who are the players implementing strategic culture? this should not only be the elites or the military and political elites of a state. Secondly, and we saw that yesterday very clearly, strategy is very closely related to the military area, but it is not only to be seen in a military context. We saw that yesterday. 4 speakers argued for a more holistic approach to strategic culture. And thirdly, based on this holistic approach, what do we understand by strategy in general? This will be one of the main points of discussion with Chiara Libisella. Is there an abstract theory of strategy? If yes, that's at least the way we teach it here at the National Academy of Defense. Is it a combination of aims, environmental factors, and standards? General, good morning. I'm just in the middle of my introduction. You have not missed anything of importance yet. We have just started. In combination with strategic culture, in this context, we always have to focus on the question why we are interested in this topic. Of course, it's the main topic of our panel. It is a topic to publish or perish. That's something Chiara will be focusing on. And that's one of the main reasons, of course, why we focus on strategic culture. I have given you the main reasons for this in a brief summary. Okay, now the system works. Why are we interested in strategic culture anyway? In my opinion, one of the main points is that the others, be it enemies or cooperation partners, the others are usually declared out of their mind if we do not agree with their thinking and action. As Weber said, the most important point is understanding the actions of those around us. We do not have to share their views and their opinions and their set of standards, but we should understand it. This also means that we have to understand ourselves. The Austrian Federal Minister for Europe Integration and Foreign Affairs yesterday did not say it clearly, but you may have understood that what she was driving at. We take a lot of measures here in Austria. The government takes a lot of measures, but the underlying motives and motivations are not always clear, and that would be one of the main points of strategic culture. Of course, strategic culture has its limitations. It is not a panacea, it is not an approach to taking decisions in individual events, and they are not a general model that allows us to project everything in all areas. This has been addressed already. We talked about it yesterday. Know yourself and know your enemy, and nothing bad will happen to you in 1,000 battles. That's one of the core quotes I would like to base my teaching on. What are the interests of our enemies and our friends? We need to understand them. That's the general background of this panel. Brigitte Peischl did not want to make the panel work too easy for us. That's why she added geo-strategy to the focus topic of our panel. Geo, the prefix geo can apply to a lot of things: geostrategy, geopolitics, geoculture, geoeconomics, geoecology even. And she set us the task of linking this to strategy. That's why I wanted to suggest to extend the time for this panel to tomorrow. But we don't have that much time, alas. So we will limit ourselves to hearing 4 very good presentations. Mr. Fronczak will be talking on the US first. After that, we will be hearing a presentation on the strategic culture of Great Britain, which will be held by my colleague and friend, Dr. Felix Schneider. After that, Professor Spira from Warsaw will be focusing on the role of narratives in the construction of contemporary Polish strategic culture. And by way of conclusion, we will take a bit of a different view, an academic view rather than an actor-specific, player-specific view by Chiara Libisella, who will be giving us a few very critical comments on the way we use terms and concepts, new concepts in strategic planning. She will also be focusing on the general topic of why we use these concepts, something that the whole conference is about. I would like to ask the panelists to stick to the time limit of about 8 to 10 minutes, because at 9:20 we have to leave this room, so that we can have the coffee break downstairs afterwards, so we can start at 9:45 or 5 minutes to 10 rather, with the panel summary and the next plenary session. I would like to ask Eva Fronczak to come to the front, to come to the podium and start with her presentation.
University in Warsaw, Poland, and I'd like to start with the information that as a PhD student, the first year PhD student, I feel very honored among such a distinguished guests here to have a lecture. Okay, so my topic is American strategic culture, but I would like to say something about the basic features of American strategic culture, but to do that, I've chosen 2 American strategic documents, and I will describe this feature basing on 2 documents. One of them is from Obama administration, Defense Strategic Culture Guidance from 2012, and the second document is National Defense Strategy. This is from Trump administration, and I will use a definition of strategic culture presented by Ken Booth, a British professor and prized theorist and author of many publications on American strategic culture. I've chosen these documents because I decided to describe some features of American strategic culture in the context of national defense, because this is my field. So the definition by Ken Booth says that strategic culture is a nation's traditions, values, attitudes, patterns of behavior, habits, customs, achievements, and particular ways of adapting to the environment and solving problems with respect to the threat or use of force. And I will now just try to present these traditions, values, American, of course, attitudes, patterns of behavior and habits, which are well visible in those 2 strategic documents. The first feature of American strategic culture is American idealism. And this is well presented in the National Defense Guidance from Obama administration. So the document says about idealism. Working with like-minded nations, the United States has created a safer, more stable and more prosperous world for the American people, our allies and our partners around the globe than existed prior to World War II. So you can see that this is very idealistic, because I would say that some people can argue, is it really more safer world or maybe not? The next quote, over the last decade, Obama writes, we have undertaken extended operations in Iraq and Afghanistan to bring stability to those countries and secure our interests, as we responsibly draw down from these two operations. So the word responsibly is, it's a very brave word here, because this is a question, was it a responsible leaving, for example, Iraq or not? So very idealistic. The next feature is exceptionalism of American strategic culture. In the document we can see this exceptionalism showing US as a global hegemony and military leader. And we can read in the document, we as US emerge even stronger in a manner that preserves our global leadership, maintains our military superiority. So you see this military superiority underlined here. And the next is US as a worldwide guard. And we read, we seek a just international order where the rights and responsibilities of nations are upheld, especially the fundamental rights of every human being. Next, we are supporting political and economic reform to ensure regional security. So the US as a guard of regional security. The next, our global responsibilities are significant. We cannot afford to fail. So these quotes are really full of exceptionalism of US. The next feature, which is present throughout this document, is American liberalism. This liberalism can be defined as promoting international cooperation. So US is also a fan of international cooperation, and Obama wrote, we are joining with allies around the world to build their capacity to promote security, prosperity, and human dignity. And he also underlined promoting diplomacy and so-called soft powers. Meeting these challenges cannot be the work of our military alone, which is why we have strengthened all the tools of American power, including diplomacy. So here this liberalism can be visible in just promoting, working with allies and international relations. And of course diplomacy. The next feature of American strategic culture is just so-called protecting the American way of life. And this American way of life can be seen in the sentence, this review, meaning this document, has been shaped by America's enduring national security interest. We seek the prosperity that flows from an open and free international economic system. So this American way of life for Americans means simply a free international economic system and the prosperity which they treat as a normal part of the everyday life. And of course, significance and reliance on military power, on the military generally in American strategic culture cannot be omitted. And the document says, as we end today's wars and reshape our armed forces, we will ensure that our military is agile, flexible, and ready for the full range of contingencies. And the next, which is very clear, I think, we will keep our armed forces the best trained, best led, best equipped fighting force in history. So this reliance and significance of military power is also always present in all strategic documents of US. And now I would like to go to the document under Trump administration, the very fresh one from this year, National Defense Strategy. And let's see what features are here also. I mean, the same features presented under Trump. And maybe something has changed. Maybe we have some new qualities under Trump. So the same is the military and international cooperation under Trump. So Trump wrote, collectively our force posture, alliance, and partnership architecture will provide the capabilities and agility required to prevail in conflict and preserve peaceful strength. And next, a more lethal, resilient, and rapidly innovating joint force, combined with a robust constellation of allies and partners, will sustain American influence. So the military and international cooperation is the same as under Obama. Trump also says yes for diplomacy, but he underlines strengthened by the military. Reinforcing America's traditional tools of diplomacy, he writes, the department provides military options to ensure the president and our diplomats negotiate from a position of strength. Also, Obama says about American values, meaning American way of life. The central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the re-emergence of long-term strategic competition, but what the national security strategy classifies as revisionist powers. So one more time, U.S. prosperity is underlined and U.S. free security. But now let's look at some new qualities which can be noticed in the Trump defense strategy. So I noticed that Trump vision is a little bit less idealistic and more realistic in approach. Because he wrote, we are emerging from a period of strategic atrophy, aware that our competitive military advantage has been eroding. You cannot imagine this kind of words under Obama, that he says competitive military of US has been eroding. So this is kind of realistic point. We are facing increased global disorder characterized by decline in the long-standing rules-based international order, creating a security environment more complex and volatile than any we have experienced in recent memory. And the next one, under Trump, there's a need for a clear-eyed appraisal of the threats we face, acknowledgement of the changing character of warfare, and the transformation of how the department conducts business. So as you see, this is more realistic. And under Trump, we see also less exceptionalism. It doesn't mean that there's no exceptionalism, because there's exceptionalism is just an indispensable part of America's strategic culture, but under Trump is less. And he says America's military has no preordained right to victory on the battlefield. Also, under Obama, I didn't find any sentence like that, that America has no preordained right to victory on the battlefield. Failure to meet our defense objectives will result in decreasing US global influence, eroding cohesion among allies and partners, and reduced access to markets that will contribute to a decline in our prosperity and standard of living. To conclude, we can say that there is, of course, continuity under Trump, but there are also some new qualities. Still, maybe some little signs, but there are some new qualities, which is more sober and more realistic and pragmatic self-image proposed by Trump. There are some signs of uncertainty about the future role of the United States in the world. and there is some abandonment of some of America's idealistic foundation. And Trump proposes a strategy based on continued leadership role for the United States, but at a lower cost due to higher levels of burden sharing between America's allies. So thank you very much. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We'll move on directly to my colleague, Felix Schneider.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Felix Schneider. I'm from the Institute for Strategy and Security Policy here in this institution. In the next 10 to 12 minutes, I will talk about what Great Britain's strategic culture is. I know that I don't have a great deal of time to elucidate my thesis. I would just like to give you an idea of my parameters. And here you can see geography, autarky, security policy, and identity. So you can see, I know you can see that these are very particular to Great Britain. So I'd just like to put that, talking about identity itself here. I'm not going to give you a geography lesson about the UK. We know that it consists of 4 parts. So here you can see England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The identity here is very important. Of course, that has to do with the composition of England. The Celts were the first who came to England, followed by the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and then these are the German tribes that came, as well as the Vikings. They came to plunder and then to settle the island. And this is extremely important. The last invasion of Great Britain were the last to invade were the Normans. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 by William the Conqueror. This was the key turning point of the settlement of the British island. And I think we can use that as a jumping-off point. Here you have the Union, where you see the King of England and the Kingdom of Scotland that merged to create the Kingdom of Great Britain. And this is our jumping-off point for my talk on the identity. In order to fulfill these strategic partnership parameters, we have these points here, particularly with regard to Great Britain. We have this feeling of superiority due to its history of the empire. Of course, through this was the largest empire on the planet, with the exception of the Mongolian Empire. This is very important, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. England had a predominant role between 1815 to the 1900s. There was absolutely no strategic competitor. You have the British way of life, of course. The American way of life came from the British way of life from the 18th and 19th century. This continued into the beginnings of the 20th century. This was the world's first superpower in this context. There was no thought of belonging to Europe. And I will come back to Brexit here. If a British person thinks of Europe, they don't think of Europe as being the British Islands being part of Europe. They think only of continental Europe. So, in terms of independence, this is probably the most important instrument that they had in their hands. So the British East India Company, I can't really go into much detail on that. This conglomerate consisted of economic and military power, the protection of their superiority on the sea, brought about increased immense wealth for the British Empire. Here you can see the British trade routes from 1750 to 1800. Here you can see the Trans-Pacific routes that they engaged in the Panama. They had no Panama Canal, where they had to sail on the Horn of Africa. Here you can see that the East Asian region was a bit underdeveloped based on the British sea trade routes, the maritime trade routes. So if you look at the triangle here that exists in the Atlantic, as a rule of thumb, here you can see processed goods were taken to Africa, where they picked up the slaves and they took them to the Caribbean, where they traded them for rum and sugar. This was the slave trade in a nutshell. Here you can see the very important trade routes in 2018, including the Pacific routes that did not exist far back in history. Here you see the Pax Britannica, 1815 to 1915. London was a World Trade Center for over 100 years. This was the center of the world for security policy, for security thinking, and this allowed the British Empire to unfold and to progress. This was the British Empire after 1918. This was at its apex of its geographic spread, geographic reach. Here you see Cape Town from the south to Alexandria in the north. You could travel from one point to the other without leaving British territory. This was absolutely amazing. This was around 1921, where the British Empire was already in decline in terms of its power and its reach. Here you see its reach extending into Palestine, and after the First World War, it was able to extend that a little bit. Here you see the strategic parameters for independence, autarky. This is extremely important in terms of imperial thinking. They had an excellent jumping-off point due to its position as an island. Mercantilism was extremely important. This went hand in hand with this imperialist stance, and its very strong navy was very important to protect against invaders. Here you see the Spanish Armada being defeated in 1588. The Spanish Armada was the largest power to attack England, and it failed miserably. Of course, thanks a bit to some luck with the weather. And this was an important stepping stone in the rise of the British Empire. You can see all of the fleet bases, and this helped with the supply chain. These were interchangeable throughout the world. They could operate throughout the globe, and this was the first superpower of the globe. They were able to undertake military intervention from anywhere in the world. Rule Britannia. This is actually rather embarrassing, and national anthem of Great Britain. Here you can see 1953. This was the naval parade, if you will, for the crowning of Elizabeth II. This is a Spithead review. I just wanted to show you that their maritime superiority was actually declining. Do you see any kind of major battleship? Here you can see the remainder of their navy. You only see a couple of cruisers. So the superpower with the dreadnoughts that was once in existence, here you can see in 1953, their naval superpower was actually over. And the hegemony was actually being passed from Great Britain to the United States. Here you can see in 1915, this is the British Navy, and its equipment. You can see up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see what they're planning for 2020, particularly with the larger ship. So now we come to security policy. Security policy, of course, is dominated by Rule Britannia and their maritime superiority. Naval superiority, of course. They had to keep their land-based army very small because of their geographic position, and they were able to invest more in their navy. And their ability to control continental global policy was a very important factor in British policy. They had to make sure that no one single power on continental globe would become so powerful to create a hegemon, to be a hegemon on the continent, because they might decide to invade England by crossing the English Channel. So they decided to lend their influence and throw the weight behind various powers in order to prevent the rise of hegemony in continental Europe. You saw this against France and Russia, and then later on in the 20th century against Germany. Here you can see the geographic parameters of the fact that they're an island. That's something new, basically. So you can see various historic examples of various attempts in order to prevent possible invasions. Here you can see the Germans failed to invade Great Britain with their submarine boats. Here you can see in the movie Das Boot, this was the idea. There was an attempt to launch a sea-based invasion, maritime invasion, that unfortunately the plans were abandoned then. Today you have the dark gap today that may present a security gap between Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland. This is the gap to prevent Russian submarines from entering the Western Atlantic. But what will happen when Brexit is a fact of life has actually come about? Here, what will we do when Scotland actually manages to achieve independence, a referendum? So this is a strategic factor of what will remain from this security policy. Will we bring everything full circle? So we have 1601. We have England that began way back, and it launched an empire in 2020. Perhaps it will, as I said, come full circle and end up the same size as it once was. Thank you very much, Felix. I forgot to mention that he's not just a colleague and a friend of mine. So he's actually one of the best military historians in Austria. So Richard, please.
From Polish World Studies University in Warsaw, and I will talk about narratives in the contemporary Polish strategic culture. Not only narratives, but also about some concept of Polish strategic culture. And of course, it's only a short case study. I will not go deeply into theory, but just short case study. And what is the Polish strategic culture and what kind of narratives in the contemporary Polish strategic culture dominate now? And there are two questions, and the first is understanding. Of course, there is a lot of concept of strategic culture and so on. I will take one simple, that coming from strategy. The strategic culture is coming tied with strategy, and I will take the concept of strategy, the classical concept, similar to Professor Jan Hallard Matlary yesterday presented from Oslo. And the strategy is broadly understood as a science and the art of using the potential to ensure survival and building power of state, and this kind of know-how to effectively manage countries in peaceful and war struggle for existence. And this is a basic meaning of strategy. And what is strategic culture in this approach? The heritage of science and the art of strategy and the level of its utilization skills, and this can be described as a strategic culture. And the situation of Poland. Of course, after in 1918, Poland regained its sovereignty. It's today we're celebrating 100 years anniversary of our independence, and at this time according to Józef Piłsudski, serious obstacles in the construction of Polish state were our abnegation of state and our state culture, resulting in equal measure from the lack of statehood for nearly 3 centuries and the weaknesses of our national character. And some of the weaknesses is Polish individualism, sometimes is kind of good because it helps us to survive, sometimes it's maybe not good. Also, lack of capability for collective and concerted action and discipline in the grouping of people with similar views. And sometimes we are talking that where are 2 poles, there are 3 parties. The advantage of private interest over the public good and the ambition of individuals and group interest over the general interest. However, the collective awareness and knowledge and pride in the success of strategy of building a nation state, a European power in the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a guiding idea for the reconstruction of strategic culture of a new-born Polish state in 1918. And very soon, in 1920, the young Polish independent states had to contest for its borders in a fight a deadly war for survival with the Bolshevik invasion. And you probably remember that this invasion was aimed not only at the Poland, but also this was kind of try to impose the communist system into Europe, to capture Poland and then maybe not Western Europe. And we stopped this in a kind of dramatic way. And after a short period of independence, Poland again lost its sovereignty for almost half of a century. And during this period, Poland lost most her elite, and it's which significantly influenced the quality of strategic thinking. For example, you know Katyń and so on and so on. The Polish elite was dramatically reduced, and the potential of Polish elite. And in 1989, at the beginning of reconstruction of sovereign democratic statehood, Poland, in similar way like in 1918, in the words of Marshal Józef Piłsudski, was strategically ravaged. And then the most important indicator of state strategic culture is ability and efficiency of the state leadership in using the science of strategy in achieving the objectives of state policy. And the shortest of strategic thinking of the elite is one of the factors of the strategic culture of this period. At this time, the Poland was subordinated to Soviet Union strategy, and not too much people thought in a different way, in a kind of independent way. And the second indicator of the strategic culture of the state is the level of science and strategic education expressed in the number and quality of universities, the number and quality of the academic staff involved in learning the strategy, and the quality and scope of strategic education of the future leadership and commanding elites of the state. And when we take example of military university, and for some time, in the Warsaw Pact time, we taught for example, operational level, how to run the front operations, army operations, and so on. But later, we even go down to teach how to run division level operations, and not too much higher. but strategy requires, military also strategy requires, to think about operational planning. That means the force application, but also force building. And there was not too much, for example, exercises or debates, the alternative, what is alternative future, what kind of equipment, what kind of structure forces is necessary to build. And also the exercises, how to design the defense campaign of all countries. Not only division or maybe corps, but how to design the strategic defense campaign, country's campaign. And now we are gradually going to this direction. And the third element of the strategic culture of the democratic states is the public strategic debate, including scientific, popular scientific and public journalism, and including scientists, politicians, and so on. And the activity of think tanks dealing with strategic studies. And there was not too much such think tanks in Poland. They are gradually increasing, the number is increasing. And the fourth element of the state strategic culture is the level of historical awareness of leadership and society, and the use of historical experience to create and justify the assumptions of the national security and military strategy. And there is a quote of French famous Marshal Foch. And meanwhile, and the so-called modernity become more and more fashionable, and this resulted that the number of history lessons were reduced, and the history was considered less and less important. But now we are going again, we are recognizing again that history is important, because history is laboratory of what happened in the past, and how a specific concept have what is the result of the application of some concept, operational concept, strategic concept, and so on. That's why history is very important. And the fifth common element of strategic culture is the level of awareness of interest and access to strategic and historical knowledge of the general public, because general public, the population should also be aware and support. And this is also in the media and so on and so on. And in 1989, we should at this time confirm the acquired sovereignty, build state security, support the economic and civilizational development of the nation and society, and strengthen our position on the international scene, especially in Europe. This was kind of strategic goal of Poland. And the experience of Polish leadership in the past 25 years of rebuilding sovereign statehood, and experience of participation in European Union and NATO institutions, as well as the widespread increase in the historical awareness, results in a slow increase in strategic competences. We have gradually, there is every year there are some officers and some civilian experts are going to foreign institutes, universities, military academies, and also taking part in exercises and so on. And also inside our country we are increasing this competence of the strategic thinking competencies. And the conclusion, there is an open national debate on national security and military issues. There is also a return to historical knowledge as the basis for the credibility of thinking and strategic action, and is the narrative for ruling party thinking in terms of national interest prevails, and seeking an effective strategy to protect it. The main motive of this narrative is belief in ability of the Polish society to build a strong state that will guarantee external and social security. It doesn't mean that total independent sovereign state inside organization. However, we should start to think in the state interest and then combine with interest of, for example, European Union. And basically, that's all. I don't want to. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just a rhetorical question. Professor Spira presented the core elements, the key elements of strategic culture. One of these elements, as he said, is academia and the level of competence of academic communities. And this competence is finally built up in Austria at the National Academy of Defense in Austria. Can somebody of you guess at the number of teachers who train in strategy and strategic culture here? This is a core subject of military studies. Do you have any idea how many people we have teaching this central subject? The answer is 1. Well, my estimate was 2. Well, it's 1 person teaching this very, very important subject. Let us now come to the last presentation. Chiara Libisella will be talking about the academic approach to strategic culture, less about the player-specific approach. She will be focusing on the British perspective. Thank you, Mr. Pankratz. I'm the second PhD student who has the honor of holding a presentation here today, and I will be focusing mainly not on strategic culture of a specific nation, but on the academic approach to strategic culture. We can discuss, if there is still time, whether this is implemented by players as such in practice, but I will mainly be talking about the concepts and dynamics of strategic culture today. As Brigadier General Peischel already mentioned, we are mainly talking about terms like narrative, cyber, hybrid, wars and resilience, and the strategic discourse in European countries and the US. In my opinion, this discourse and the terms used in it are very problematic. In particular, I would like to point out that these 4 concepts are or form part of a more general problem. This problem is that the strategic discourse as a whole consists of a variety of concepts that do seem promising, but finally remain vague and opaque. In particular, I'm referring to concepts that have tried to pin down apparently new or different forms of war, including, in addition to the 4 concepts we have already mentioned, popular concepts such as new wars, information warfare, counterinsurgency, and network-centric warfare. These concepts have been proliferating, especially since the end of the Cold War, and have come and gone like fashions. Most of the time, these concepts are based in singular events which help them gain traction. The concept of hybrid warfare, for example, was coined since the beginning of the 2000 years, about 2007, but only became widely used after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. Network-centric warfare was promoted thanks to the Gulf War. Counterinsurgency is a concept that wasn't in use very broadly for many years, but rediscovered after the 9/11 attacks. After that, it was promoted as a sort of panacea against irregular fighters. Ladies and gentlemen, once these concepts become popular, thanks to a singular event like this, they dominate the strategic discourse for some time, both in the military and in academia. Accordingly, for years, energy and resources were spent on exploring so-called counterinsurgencies, while other areas were neglected. In the past few years, the interest in these concepts has decreased slightly. Right now, hybrid warfare has taken over as the dominant concept on the research agenda. Quite similarly, we could witness how the concept of new wars became increasingly popular. Those of you who know it, this was in the early 2000s. New wars was a very popular concept back then, filling several academic journals. And since 2010, new wars is a term that is hardly ever heard in academic discourse. The central element here is that these concepts and the way they change and appear and disappear are just fashions. They are not actually a reflection of a changing culture of war. Again and again, they are created because there seems to be a new development. But the concepts are created, they are widely used, and then they disappear, and they do not leave behind very much in terms of actual knowledge or increase of knowledge on war and war studies. The drive to continuously coin new concepts affects their quality. These concepts are vague and broad. Just take the example of hybrid warfare. This is not a uniform concept in any way. There is no official definition of it. Even academics often don't define the term. Maybe because they assume that everybody knows what they are talking about, because everybody's using the term. But this does not live up to academic standards. The concept of hybrid warfare is also applied to very different situations. Originally, Frank Hoffman coined this term for the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006. Then it gained traction with the Russian annexation of Crimea. And since then it has been applied to many different cases, such as the Islamic State or the war in Afghanistan. It may be that these wars have certain things in common, but I think they have many more differences than commonalities, so I don't see the point in putting such different conflicts into the same category of war and using the same concepts for them. As these concepts are applied to different cases, and as these concepts are poorly defined as well, they become broader and broader all the time, becoming increasingly superficial. In the end, they are so superficial that they cannot be used to guide academic research anymore, and they can't be used for strategic analysis or planning in any way. Interestingly, all these concepts claim to capture new phenomena that demand new concepts. In the end, and we've heard this many times during the past days at this conference, many of these terms are just a rediscovery of existing concepts. I don't have to give you specific examples. This has been discussed at the conference. But the main point for academia and academic research is that these concepts fail to show us that we already have a lot of knowledge that we can base our research on. Coining and inventing new concepts tends to hide the fact that we already know a lot, that we already know comprehensive strategies or tactics. Because after all, Hybrid warfare is not new, it's just good strategy, and this claim to inherent newness is something that mainly makes these new conceptual frameworks problematic for scientific research. We keep reinventing ourselves and we forget what we already know. If you look at the handbooks on strategic culture, the content changes all the time, changes every few years, and there is no core content in this field, but there should be. Another problem is that these concepts lead our attention to the tactical level, away from broader strategic and political questions. So we fail to actually deal with strategy for the main part of our time. What I want to highlight with this is that the field of strategic studies is, in addition to the military, a driving force behind the development and proliferation of these superficial concepts. As an academic field, strategic studies should be based on critical reflection, empirical analysis, and conceptual and theoretical debates. It seems there is a tendency to blindly adopt and reuse these concepts and proliferate them. What could be the reasons for this phenomenon? Well, at this point I can only speculate. Why? On the one hand, this problem may be connected to something that plagues academia more generally, innovation. It has become a value per se. Publish or perish is the general concept. If you publish new papers, you have to be innovative, because of course you can't publish something that's already known. And if you use new concepts, you can basically publish new approaches, and that will make it interesting. Bandwagoning on the latest trend, on the currently dominant concept, will also be beneficial in getting published. Secondly, these conceptual fashions are connected to some characteristics of the field of strategic studies per se. This field wants to be policy relevant and wants to be relevant for real life events. This can be an advantage, but sometimes also puts this field of research at a disadvantage. Since they want to be policy relevant, they need to develop new concepts for new events. This may be seen as a strategically valuable reaction to new events, but in actual fact, these new concepts fail to explain why these new concepts are so superficial and ahistorical. And they are. In my opinion, these concepts and terms are just fashions. One of the reasons may be that we do not have any general theory on strategy, or we have a certain lack of general strategic knowledge. The field of strategic studies has become a critical, reflective voice in strategic discourse, or rather it should be. What can we do to change this situation? I'm afraid there's not much we can do in the short term. There will always be new concepts, new terms will keep turning up. In the conference next year there may be new terms again. But what we can do is that we could take a more critical approach to these new fashionable concepts, treat them as such, and critically examine their practical value. I think that a development of general strategic theory would benefit this field of research. A critical reflection in the field of strategic studies would be a new challenge and a very valuable new development. That's the main argument I wanted to present in my presentation. We need more reflection on the concepts we're using.
Thanks. So you know why I pointed out several occasions that our colleagues will be providing input on these critical reflections. This is perfectly justified. I think we need to really wake up to this. We need to be aware of what exactly we're doing here. It's not just about confirming what already is in existence, but we need to rethink things. We need to think outside the box. So now we have a few minutes for discussion. I would like to collect a number of questions. Let us go in order. Allow me to point out that we have to leave at 9:20. That is the end of our session. And of course, you have every opportunity to speak with the panelists one-on-one during the break. I had a question for the presentation on Griffin. What about the new initiative on the European Intervention Initiative? Brexit, security and defense, for example, in this entire area. There are many people talking about that. How is that being seen and evaluated? Is there an attempt in Europe, on continental Europe, to help shape that? Or to prevent many things from taking place? Are we looking at an additional medium-sized player on the world stage once Brexit actually takes place? The second question has to goes to the concepts and strategies when you're talking about the European level. And this is something I've been focusing for a number of years. I think there are a number of similar strategies, space strategy, especially global strategy, for example. When I look at this against the backdrop of your comments, I see the development on this actual strategic level being dominated by election cycles. So you have high representatives and other high-ranking officials that, of course, are paid by the governments, and every day they have come up with a new idea. And they come up with a new strategy. And then they come up with a new strategy, of course, that they are trying to impose on us. On my Polish colleagues, my question is, now, egal, what about Europe? Or how do you see us? What about Europe? Who would like to begin? Felix? I would like to point out that I'm not a political scientist. I see this in the context of history, of course, so with the benefit of several years of hindsight. Allow me to give you my following impression. When we talk about European initiatives, I think this is very important to take into account the following views with the British. You have the British on one side and the Europeans on the other. They say, I'm going to the continent, going to Europe. It may seem ridiculous to us, but this is exactly how they see it. Geographically speaking, they do not see themselves as being part of Europe. Of course they are. But this is the point of departure when you look at surveys regarding a common European strategy. You see the British people are at the negative end of the scale. Anything that would subjugate a British military strength within the context of a European framework gives rise to great ambivalence. This is very similar to what we see in France. We see that the BRICS actually plays a great deal of importance on their nuclear power. We know that it's very expensive. It costs a great deal of money, a great deal of treasure. We know that the British role in NATO is actually quite small, despite their plans to build giant naval ships. But, of course, they wish to signal that perhaps in the context of Brexit, they would like to move toward more independence. Perhaps this is something that they are only imagining. Yes, in policy making. In politics, we see this phenomenon actually quite more in a more pronounced way. People are trying to impress their voters with new ideas, and the election cycles are completely counterproductive for strategic thinking. They run completely counter to strategic thinking. For that reason, as I said, we still have to develop new strategic plans. We have to make sure that there are people behind these ideas that think in the long term, that are able to question these new fashionable ways of thinking, perhaps can work on these with a longer term perspective against the backdrop of the politicians, and perhaps without any type of impact on day-to-day politics.
The strategy is, as we know, subordinated to strategic goal, which is the political end of political process, and the political strategic goal is designed by states, and until the European Union is not state, that we should only coordinate the strategic goals of specific states, and then we may try to find the strategy, because until we don't have a common strategic goal clearly defined, agreed by all states, then it's difficult to find the strategy, because it's like Alice, you know, in this novel, that what is the road? Oh, where are you going to go? And then I will tell you what is the road. Yeah? And this is the same for European Union, that we should coordinate strategic goals now this, for national states, and then look for strategy. Thank you.
Kurze Anmerkung dazu, Herr Oberst, dann haben wir noch eine zweite Frage.
I'm wondering about that answer, because as I learned in Brussels, the people were very, very, and even more busy to develop within shortest time the European global strategy. So what we do have is based on European strategy 2003 with upgrade 2008. Now we have a brand new one. It is without any content, let's say that way. But I have only to refer as well to the Norwegian professor on Monday evening, Tuesday evening. So I think there's somehow confusion to me, because it was designed and developed by the member states. So the European global strategy is product of all, or not?
Okay.
We have in Poland, we have a so-called security science, which is similar to security studies, which the main question is how to survive and develop itself by a specific entity. The main is the state, of course, or group of states. And the strategy in this case is very important for security studies. And I think that the future depends on the willingness of states, of population, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very
A question? I will be very brief. It's very interesting to hear these new terms. I can out myself. I think it's very important to talk about new terminology, and I think we have to be very critical about this when we think about those in depth. It's not just about following the fashionable trends, but what is the alternative? That's why I think it's very important, because we have to encourage people to think for themselves, to make a competition. I know most people know what the hybrid thinking is. They know this from the automotive industry. Of course, we can focus on Clausewitz. It's very difficult to use Clausewitz in the modern context. As is sometimes very difficult to move away from that in the strategic discourse. I support that 100%. I was a bit surprised at what you said, particularly when you're talking about new terminology, particularly in the context of NATO and the EU, and the fact that they've become more established. That's not just what we're discussing here, that actually things are being implemented and operationalized and on the ground. This is something that you've actually given a rather generalized judgment about. There are probably a lot more publications on it that would like to conceal these definitions. But it doesn't mean that we disagree with the concept or with the terminology in and of itself. Especially when you look at hybrid warfare, I don't think nobody believes this is a new concept. This is a new idea. This may be a new buzzword, but we know that this is certainly not a new development. The fact that something is not new does not mean that we have understood it. It doesn't mean that we should not begin to evaluate that in more depth, and that there was nothing to implement in that context. So when we look at hybrid warfare and hybrid threats, I think that we really should cast a general judgment on those terms. I think we need to discuss them in a constructive way. And we look at NATO and the EU, particularly with the Iran coalition here, we're talking about the operationalization, making these things operable. Very briefly, please. Because I come from NATO structures, but I'm actually on the outside of NATO structures. I can say that to say that NATO is NATO is not that easy. There are so many different headquarters and very many different approaches, particularly also academic terminology, particularly if you're talking about maritime command in London. I would be very cautious here. They would be very cautious, perhaps, in expressing a different point of view from that in Brussels. So you have very different areas and very different many different departments, and you have different speeds that we see. You can really say that everything comes under the heading of NATO in general. So I just wanted to support what everybody was saying here at the table. So in my presentation, I was really just limiting myself to the studies, to the science. So these ideas are being used in the academic circles as well as in practice. I come from academic circles myself, so I was really referring to that. But you have to look at what these terms mean for the science of strategic studies. Then the problem is that nobody is defining their terms. They're saying hybrid warfare here and there, but everybody uses it in a different context. You have to actually define your terms. What do you mean by hybrid warfare? You have to see what people are using, how they define it, and the problem is that many different academic papers treat these terms quite differently. And because these are fashionable terms, buzzwords, catchphrases, if you will. And the problem is you have to engage in in-depth analysis here. And sometimes these ideas become too broad, and you can't really narrow them down to their essence. So when you say that NATO and the EU are using these terms, yes, that is exactly where you have to define these terms. You have to look exactly what they entail, what they mean. Unfortunately, I have to interrupt the discussion. No, you are here to make sure that we wrap up on time at 9:20. Don't shake your head. If I would be capable of ending the discussion, ending the panel at 9:20. Thank you very much for the discussion. As I said at the very beginning of the session, I don't know why we would conduct this panel for a day and a half. Maybe we could do that for next year. Maybe we'll create a permanent panel as they have in the Austrian Parliament. Thank you very much for your very interesting contributions. I can see from the contributions here in the discussion that everybody is thinking 3 steps further. Of course, we're going to the coffee break, and there's plenty of time to share your views one-on-one with the panelists and with all the other participants. Thank you very much.